Small Business and Information Technology. This is our second meeting of the interim. I want to thank everybody, first meeting for the interim. I want to thank everybody for being present today. If you do have a cell phone, if you would just please turn that to silence or vibrate as we begin our meeting and our agenda today. Before we get started, I do want to announce we have two new analysts that are assigned to this committee, both grad fellows working for LRC. That's Helen MacArthur and Eric Rodenberg that are sitting to my left in the front. And so welcome them for their service they'll be providing to the committee. And Sasha, if you would, please call the roll.
Senator Boswell, Senator Funke Frohmeyer,
Present.
Senator Gardler, Senator Harper Angel, Senator Howell, Senator Mills, Senator Storm, Senator Thomas, Senator Wheeler, Senator Wilson,
Here.
Representative All,
Here.
Representative Baker,
Here.
Representative Dotson, Representative Pfister,
Here.
Representative Frazier Gordon, Representative Freeland,
Here.
Representative Fugit,
Here.
Representative Grossberg, Representative Heath, Representative Kulkarni,
Present.
Representative Lawrence, Representative Maddox,
Here.
Representative Massaroni,
Here.
Representative McPherson,
Here.
Representative Pollock,
Here.
Representative Reed,
Here.
Representative Roberts, Representative Stalker,
Present.
Representative Tackett Lafferty,
Here.
Representative Tate, Representative Timoney, Representative Truitt,
Here.
Representative Wesley, Representative White,
Here.
Representative Wilson, Representative Witten,
Here.
Co-Chair Wise,
Present.
Co-Chair King,
Present.
Co-Chair Pratt.
Perfect timing. Thank you all for they're here today. And is there any members that have any introductions of any special guests that they have in the audience? Representative Fugit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce one of my county judges, Breathitt County Judge Jeff Noble, here with me today. And then for a few years, we've talked about trails in the mountains, and our executive director of the First Frontier Appalachian Trail System is here with us today, Scott Smith. I appreciate them riding down with me today. Thank you, Mr.
Wonderful.
Chairman.
Gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Let's give them a round of applause for making the trip today. Also, Representative McPherson.
Yes, I've got a special guest with me, my granddaughter, Easton McPherson. Made the trip this morning.
Wonderful. Good to see you, young lady. I see you back there. Thank you so much for being here today and for making the trip up here to spend with your grandfather. Let's go ahead and get our agenda started for today, if that's okay. I would first like to call up for the Office of Broadband Development for an update. If we would have those two that are presenting, that being Megan Sanfus, the Executive Director of Office of Broadband Development, and John Hicks, State Budget Director. I know you are no strangers to the process here. If you would, just identify yourselves both for the record. Make sure your microphones are on green in terms of your introductions, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Hicks, Secretary of the Governor's Cabinet and State Budget Director.
Megan Sanfus, Executive Director, Office of Broadband Development.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to come back before this committee, the committee that where some of the broadband legislation began, to give you all an update. And you've got a really good agenda. You got folks following us that are really knowledgeable, and we'll give you some updates. So we'll do a little bit of back and forth, and I want to give you a little bit of recent background. You all appropriated $300 million roughly from the American Rescue Plan Act toward expanding broadband across Kentucky to unserved and underserved areas of Kentucky. So last summer we awarded our first round of awards, grant awards, that subsidize the construction of broadband deployment. There were 47 awards, about $90 million, touching about 36 counties, with a total investment of over $200 million. And these are construction projects, and the latest information we have is a little over a dozen of those that are fully under bid and under construction. And I'll turn it over to Megan to talk about our next round of awards.
Okay. In November, we opened up the second round of broadband deployment grants for applications. Those were open until the beginning of February. After the due date, we had the challenge process, which we had 103 applications that requested $483 million in funds. We had about $206 million available. That was the remaining state and local fiscal recovery funds that were left from the first round, and the entire allotment of the capital projects funds, which is also ARPA money. So we had a request for $483 million in grant funds. It was a little over $900 million in total project costs. There were proposals in 77 counties to provide service to 127,000 locations. The priority for that round was also those no service areas with under 10.1 speeds available. So the really underserved areas, unserved areas. We had in the challenge process a significant number of challenges received. 72 of the applications were challenged, and that was a total of 124 total challenges. So some of the applications had multiple challenges to them. 40,000 locations, so a third of all of the locations that were submitted were challenged. So that was very time consuming to get through that due to the high volume. So now the challenges have been determined, and the applications are going through revisions to be evaluated. We're expecting to issue awards at the end of July. Some of the things that have happened related to the ARPA funds, the Treasury issued supplemental guidance in May to address some of the concerns that were raised by the internet providers about procurement and asset ownership and the income generated by these projects once they're operational. So that was something that was very timely, or maybe not timely, but necessary in order for the concerns for the internet providers to be addressed regarding some of those outstanding issues that they've been concerned about.
Let me add a little bit. You all passed legislation that put a first priority on locations with no internet service first, not unserved. I mean, not slow internet, no internet. And so in these applications, we've asked those applicants to identify the number of locations that have no internet, and then also the number that have unserved, which is a speed of 25 meg download or 3 meg upload or less. So wanted you to all know that, and then you set something that's really unique across the country. You set other priorities that was based upon lowest density, meaning fewest households, in a route mile. For example, the end of the county road is a good example. And so we're one of the only states that have put into statute kind of let's get to the end of the road as a priority. And so in evaluating the applications, those are going to be considerations that are part of the request for the process and part of the decision-making process. So it's a really interesting part of it. And then when she speaks of challenges, right, that's where an applicant has said, I'm going to serve these locations, and another service provider says, I already served that location. That's the process that Megan was describing, that there's challenges, and there were so many of them. So that's one of the things we're learning as we particularly go through the second round is there are different sets of data, that one applicant and another provider provides. So you want to give some, effort to the providers who have to check on those challenges. That takes some time to say they had to publicly go take a look at the applications and see where someone else was, in essence, requesting funding to build in their service area. So that's a very complicated process. Every state's doing this. But it's something I wanted to kind of highlight for you in terms of the level of effort. One other thing you all did in the last budget process out of the Federal American Rescue Plan Act is added $20 million for a program that I call the Pole Replacement Program. It is a subsidy. It's called the Rural Infrastructure Improvement Fund, $20 million. It's also intended to subsidize the cost of pole replacements when you hang fiber optic cable on a telephone pole. When you do the make-ready design, some of these poles have to be replaced or repaired. And so those are costs to that internet provider. And so you all passed $20 million for projects that are seeking to hit unserved locations. So you were consistent in terms of the priorities for this other program. And that's we've only got a handful of applications for that so far. It's a first come, first serve until that $20 million is exhausted. So that's something else that Megan's office is also administering. And so the real news, that's coming up that you've heard about in the bipartisan infrastructure law that the federal government passed is the new Broadband Equity Access and Development Deployment Program. Basically, it's going to be $42 billion available to all 50 states, D.C., and the territories to help deploy broadband, in Kentucky and all these other states. The goal being universal access to reliable, affordable, high-speed internet. So your zip code shouldn't matter about whether or not you have access to this important utility. And so the big headline is by the end of next week, according to the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, who's going to administer these funds, they're going to announce how much each state receives out of that $42 billion. So we're, crossing our fingers and expecting really good things. One of the processes by which they determine how much each state will get is the Federal Communications Commission has put out multiple iterations of a map to identify, one, where are all households and businesses, two, which ones have service and at what speed. So they're going to use your proportion of unserved and underserved locations to determine our share, Kentucky's share of that $42 billion. So as a part of that process, state governments, local governments, and internet providers were challenged the map, right? We looked at the map and said, have they counted it correctly? Do they have all the locations that should be there? Have they determined which ones are unserved or underserved properly? Megan and the staff in the consulting firm that she's working with issued 15,000 challenges roughly to that first map, and over 14,800 were accepted. What that means is we've helped correct the map for Kentucky so that we can get the best amount of allocation from the federal government as possible. So that's a very data intensive technical issue. It's finished. The FCC map is done, and they're going to announce their allocations. They said by June 30th, so that would be Friday a week from now.
As part of the BEAD program, we have to produce a 5-year action plan by August 12th. That is underway. It will establish the goals and priorities and serves as a needs assessment for the Commonwealth, which will also inform our initial proposal, which is where we describe to the NTIA how we will be doing the competitive process for the grant funds. So we've been working on gathering the data and information and doing the outreach that was necessary to complete the action plan. We have contracted with Connected Nation, which is a Kentucky-based nonprofit, back in October to help with our statewide plan. And we held a 14-stop listening tour, as well as a couple of virtual sessions back in February and March to help inform the plan and get input. So we are also working on that with the Education and Labor Cabinet, who is developing a companion digital equity plan that's also a requirement for the BEAD funds. Part of our statutory requirement is to produce an interactive statewide map of broadband availability, and so we have been working on that. We have incorporated data collected directly from the internet providers as well as the FCC data to produce a location-specific granular availability map. It'll be user-friendly and show all in one place what the existing funding for broadband projects looks like. Our funding, as well as the other federal funding sources and even local sources out there, to visualize the broadband availability and identify the unserved and underserved locations. So that is nearly complete. We have been kind of piloting it amongst the contributors to the map to make sure that we're showing what needs to be showed, and we're hoping to release that soon. So after we submit the action plan, we will have to create the initial proposal by the end of this calendar year, and this will be where we describe how we'll spend the funds, and we will align that with the provisions of KRS Chapter 224A, just to harmonize the federal requirements with the state requirements for our program. And once our initial proposal is approved, we will have the release of 20% of those BEAD funds. So it's potential, sometime early next year we could have another round of grant funding available. So, and then after that, we have another year to produce the final proposal, which will kind of take our lessons learned from the first, the initial proposal and shore up all of the things that need to be included. And that will, when we will release, they'll get the additional 80% of the funds.
And let me just add that, there have been outside entities, one of whom is going to be speaking with you today, who've done estimates on using the FCC's MAPS data on how much each state may receive. And so we've seen estimates from $700 million to $1 billion. And so those are really significant dollars. But we've got a really significant goal here, which is the universal service. And so we're going to find out by June 30th, how it's close to that. But as Megan said, we've got several steps each state has to comply with before those funds are released. And so we won't take a year to finish that final proposal. We will move as expeditiously as we're able to in terms of stepping through these compliance issues with the federal government. And one little small remark about the map that we're going to put out online. User friendly is a very subjective term. So. So it will be, for those who know how to use GIS information, it will be friendly. For those who don't, it'll take a little while. But it is probably the best presentation we've ever had of showing where is it, where isn't it, and how fast is it. And as Megan said, and Mr. Chairman, we're due to submit you another semi-annual report. And in that, Megan's folks have detailed out the other federal grant awards that have taken place directly to providers, not through our program, that have been awarded and shows some information for you. It's a best compilation that I've seen on where the U.S. Department of Agriculture has put in a whole lot of money, for example, and you all can take a look at what parts of the state that those projects are for. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I think we'll stop and happy to take any questions.
Thank you both very much for the update. And John, you answered my question I was going to ask about the challenges, so thank you for getting into the weeds on that. We do have a few members with some questions. First, Representative All.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for the presentation. I think that everybody up here would agree that we're pretty excited, frankly, on where we're going to be in a few short years, thanks to this significant federal investment in our rural broadband infrastructure, and where we're going is, quite frankly, pretty exciting. I do have some questions around some of the initial rounds of the grants. You said that there was about $90 million or so awarded in the first round that went to 36 different counties. Do you have a map? We all love looking at maps. Do you have a map that kind of lays out and shows where that is and where maybe the second round of that funding is trying to go if it wasn't for the challenges or anything to that nature?
Those are both on our website, and I can send links to you so you can see where they are. The second round, the challenge areas have not been removed from the map yet, but you could see basically where the proposals were.
Now, we'll say on the first round, it is user-friendly. Even I can go in there and look at application 1, application 2, where it is, how much money it is, how many locations it's supposed to build to, at least provide service to. So that one is really, really readily available. And as Megan said, we will be following up with the second round information, but because of all the challenges that she described, our statute gives those applicants an opportunity to revise their application. So that if we knocked out a number of locations, they come back with a smaller number of locations and a revised application. So we're in the process of nearly completing that part, the receipt of those. And as she said, there were so many applications that were challenged. There are many applications that will be revised. Mm-hmm. Secondly, Representative Hall, I'm going to say, Representative Petrie in the last Appropriations Revenue Committee meeting asked us to provide the same kind of information that you just asked for. So we'll make sure and send that information, Mr. Chairman, to this committee as well, just so you have the same information.
Thank you very much. And one last question. The third round, we haven't got to that yet. Understand that. Is there any expiration upon which we're at liability of possibly losing the rest of that funding if we don't get those monies out the door?
So we have to have all of those funds allocated by the end of 2027.
Okay.
And that's the BEAD funds,
Yes.
right? For the ARPA funds, sorry for the acronym, these have to be obligated by the end of calendar 26. That's right? Yeah, and and given the second round of applications is oversubscribed to the amount of money we have, we don't expect to have any problems, at least awarding the amounts.
That's where I was going. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Co-Chair Pratt.
Thanks, sir. If you indulge me, I have several questions. You're surprised at. Pole attachments. We gave you $20 million to do that. And I realize it's an unfair question when I ask you that, because I know first that you got to get the bids out. Then how much of that $20 million have we spent?
So we have applications for just under $200,000 right now. We're waiting on some information back from the providers in order to get those out the door. But I think one of the challenges that they're facing is the amount of time it's taking to get the pole attachment permits from, and so that, so since we were talking about the period from July 1st of last year until current, I think there's a number that are pending, and I'm expecting the floodgates on those to open up sometime in the near future.
Well, actually, you touched on my second question. I'm hearing from the broadband providers that the utilities, I realize they're overwhelmed, are extremely slow at getting back the pole when they ask for pole attachments. What can we do to help speed that process up?
That's a good question, Mr. Co-Chairman. You all, the Public Service Commission had put out a new regulation over a year ago about pole attachment agreements. So that was a piece of work that was helpful, I believe, to both sides of those arrangements. But beyond that, I don't have any really strong advice about, when a pole owner, right, has to be the one that blesses and agrees to the pole attachment agreement. There's a bit of a one-sided kind of leverage there in terms of timing and cost.
We may want to talk about that, how we can speed that little process up. Challenge process, something I heard from providers, was people that were saying they had a served area, Megan and you and I talked about this, also claim that as an area they want money to serve. Is that still an ongoing problem? Is that cleared up a little bit?
So, there were some instances where there were challenges for locations that a provider issued a challenge for a location they also had applied for funding for. That's something that we will consider in the evaluation process. But we're aware of that.
Okay.
And there also, Mr. Co-Chair, there's also provision in our state law that says if that existing provider can within 12 months, construct, and can show that they've got financing in a project to construct to those areas, that's allowed under our statute.
Okay. You also touched on the $42 billion coming down from the federal government. I just read an article, and I hope you guys can enlighten me, or maybe the next group can. They're saying with the new maps, which is challenging them along with itself, that states there's going to be new winners and new losers in this. Where does Kentucky stand as far as what we thought we were going to get and what we are going to get of that $42 billion, or do you know?
Well, and those articles are about the next version of the FCC map compared to the prior version of the FCC map. And so when we were talking about the 15,000 challenges, for example, that's one example of changes that have occurred in a new map. So in the case of the 15,000, to our benefit, because we identified more properly more unserved and underserved areas. So and it's kind of like, looking at, your third draft of a brief that an attorney would write. You just made changes to it. The bottom line is the data that they have now is the data they're going to base their allocation on. So we're all done, if you will, with challenging it. So the result will be, whatever the NTIA, announces on June 30th or so.
So it sounds like our amount may go up, which is good news for Kentuckians.
It will be because of the challenges that were made, yes.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate everything you all do.
Thank you. Senator Funky Fromar.
Thank you, Co-Chair Max Wise and Co-Chair Pratt. You might have already brought to the surface one of my questions. And Megan, I just have to thank you. Your diligence is tremendous, and I think it's going to result in more money for Kentucky. So thanks for doing that heavy lifting. Relative to, I had a question, and it could be about that connection permit. So it might directly be, we believe in Bracken County as the example, that it's served, but yet the constituents are saying they don't have access. And it was coming back that there could be a connection permit of $20,000. How is that holding up this process?
Is that for a particular residence?
Yes. And not connecting into the residence, but it appears that there's some requirement to cross over a railroad track.
Oh, okay. Is it this the constituent that's been emailing?
Yes.
Okay.
And I can't imagine that railroad tracks aren't an issue all over Kentucky. So I was wondering if this is a Kentucky issue.
I think when my last email to him, there's a number of issues there, and I think you were copied on that one too. There's a railroad track. There's an RDOF commitment from a different internet provider. Then he's also got access to pretty high speed fixed wireless there. So as the FCC sees it, he is served, but that's not going to impact the RDOF commitment. It's just going to take some time for the provider that has that commitment to build to that area because they're not currently that close.
And RDOF is another acronym of a federal round of funding for broadband deployment.
So I think, if the nearby provider, and that's something I can look into if they have any plans to cross the line, but considering one of their competitors has the RDOF funding to build across the line, they may just, decide to not go after all of the rights of way and railroad crossing and all the other permits that are necessary to cross. So.
Representative Freeland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and I appreciate you for being so accessible for many of my constituents. But just a quick question. With the ARPA funds, the way the process and the grant process is being done, do you know if the money that is expected to come to Kentucky, the BEAD money, I hope I'm saying that right, will the grant process, application process be the same, the goal of the unserved and underserved areas?
Yeah, the priority for BEAD is also the unserved areas. And so we have to address all of the unserved areas before we're able to move on to the underserved or any other use of those funds.
And so that's why I say that our statute now aligns really nicely with this federal program.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Representative Kulkarni.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for presenting. We're all very excited and impatient. I want to understand, and at the risk of sort of reiterating what some of my colleagues have mentioned, I want to understand the pots of money, federal money, how much we got, how much we've spent, and what is going to become available, as you mentioned, in the next round of funding. So there's a lot of acronyms that have been thrown around here, and I might be a little slow on the uptake there, but I just want you all to go over, just very briefly, ARPA, how much money, BEAD, what is that? Is that a state funding specifically? Is it where is all the money coming from federally? And then my other question is where it's going. So it's going to providers last mile, correct? Like all of this is the last mile providers, like we're just people getting internet in their homes. You're going to be providing funding over the course of the next several years. Is there a timeline when these providers have to then show that they have actually connected internet to our constituents?
Okay, well, let me start with the funding. All of this is federal funding. The first $300 million was from the American Rescue Plan Act. It had two pieces. The state local fiscal recovery fund, which was $117 million, and the capital projects fund, which was $182 million. The governor recommended, the General Assembly agreed. We wanted to put that second batch into broadband. There were other possible uses. So that first $300 million is out of the ARPA funds. We've awarded $90 million roughly of that. We are in the process of evaluating to award the other $200+ million in this round two. So that's where that 300 is. The rest of the funds, the up to $1 billion example, is the federal BEAD program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. That is the allocations to be announced at the end of next week. We've got an action plan that we have to submit. We have an initial proposal that we have to submit, which will unlock 20% of that BEAD funding, and then a final proposal which will then make available the remainder of Kentucky's allocation. The recipients are going to be applicants of any type, internet service providers, be they privately owned, municipalities, telephone co-ops, electric co-ops. Any internet provider is open to apply for. So it's agnostic as to the type of business that is doing that. The priorities, as Megan has said, consistent with our state law, is unserved and underserved. Unserved first, and if you have, if we are so fortunate that this money will yield universal service, meaning that we will be able to build to all locations, then you can move down the line and use what's left over for underserved, which means you've got speeds, of less than 25 meg download. And then there's even, if you've got all that money, I'll use an example, Rhode Island, right? Rhode Island is not real big, and they have a high percentage of already served. So there are other uses for that fund, such as providing what is called digital equity, providing devices to low income and other populations, to provide training on how to use internet devices. The digital equity grant that Megan mentioned that the Education and Labor Cabinet's working on, they're currently inventorying all the things that we're doing by any type of organization in Kentucky on helping people who need help to acquire devices and to learn how to use them. So, if you build it, you've got to have the ability to use it. And so there's another portion of the BEAD program, this is much smaller, that is trying to address those kinds of gaps out there among various populations, including the disabled, seniors, low income, all types of populations that are identified in the federal law. So that's something else we're moving on in parallel track, is trying to figure out now where do we need to put resources and capabilities to help Kentuckians who need help. Because if we've got the infrastructure, you've got to have the devices and the skills to use them. And so they're working on that last two pieces.
And that part, is from BEAD.
Both are BEAD, yes.
Both are BEAD.
Yes, that's right. And the plan that Megan is talking about, the 5-year action plan, has to combine the planning processes of both the infrastructure piece, which is the biggest piece, and the digital equity piece. And so we're working with the Education and Labor Cabinet. Those 14 listening sessions that were held out all around the state incorporated also the digital equity provisions of that, to get input so that they can put up their plan together that gets combined with the infrastructure plan.
And then, sorry, my
please
last
proceed.
question. I'm so sorry, Mr. Chairman. What timeline or parameters or guidelines do the providers have to show how they've spent the money that they have received?
So there are some very rigid and strong requirements in the BEAD requirements to we have to put in clawback provisions and compliance and inspection and things to make sure that the money that we spend is actually doing what we intended for it to do. So those are things that will work into the grant agreements. But they have, I think once they're awarded, they have some time to build. I think they're anticipating the construction for the BEAD projects is going to go, maybe even into up to 2030, depending on how late they're awarded. But then there's some compliance timelines that they are required to provide the services that they agreed to provide. I think there's maybe a 5-year requirement in our current grant agreements, but I think there's potential to require longer.
Yeah, and there's still some further guidance that we're expecting from the federal government on the BEAD program. We've got some, but we don't have all of it because Megan and her cohorts work with the National Telecommunications and Information Administration on that on a routine basis. So we expect that. But there's a I'll say a strong accountability set of provisions in there, and in the grant agreements. Those are laid out. So the second party, the winner of the grant agreement, has to pledge and certify that I'm going to create capabilities of providing 100 meg download, 100 meg upload, for the ARPA funds and where they are. And so we're going to be following behind them and checking is that infrastructure in place? Does it meet the technical requirements of speed? Now, what's got then to happen is that subscribers need to subscribe. right? So that part of it is open to the marketplace, right? Is you can build it, but will somebody, subscribe it? And we see in these applications where these companies, they estimate the take-up rate, right? As they're trying to build a financial model on will this work, right? The subsidy that the government's providing for this construction, will it be sufficient once they get it built and once the entity, the household or the business signs up for it? So it's a really interesting public-private model that the United States is trying here. Very different than how we did electrical utilities years and years ago.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Great questions, and thank you all so much for the informative answers. I don't see any other members with any further questions, so we're going to proceed with our agenda. But thank you all so much for being here, for testifying. And also, Megan, thank you for handling the constituent questions, just like Senator Funky Fromar. Every one of us up here received similar ones, so thank you for the work that you're doing in answering those on our behalf. Next on our agenda is the future of broadband deployment, that being national and state trends in broadband development. If our next panelists would make their way to the table. Tyler Campbell, Executive Director of the Kentucky Rural Broadband Association, and also Mr. John Higginbotham with Americans Communication Association, ACA Connects. Gentlemen, you should know the routine. Please identify yourselves for the record, and you have the floor to proceed.
Chairman Wise, Co-Chair Pratt, and Co-Chair King, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Tyler Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the Kentucky Rural Broadband Association.
Hi, John Higginbotham, Executive Vice. Didn't press the button. John Higginbotham, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of ACA Connects.
Perfect. Thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today and present on the future of broadband deployment here in the Commonwealth as we identify national and state trends impacting broadband development. Again, I'm with the Kentucky Rural Broadband Association, previously known as the Kentucky Telecom Association, and I'm very pleased to be here to talk about this. A lot of what I will touch on had to do with funding, the state trends, financial trends that you're seeing at the federal level. So, Representative Kulkarni, some of those acronyms that you were referring to earlier, I will actually mention in my presentation, and if you have any other questions, I can hopefully try to break some of that down for you, because it is alphabet soup when it comes to a lot of this. Just by way of introduction, I wanted to introduce you to my association for those of you that may not be familiar with our group. Our Rural Broadband Association members consist of 18 community-based rural broadband providers. We serve all or part of 45 counties in the Commonwealth and have deployed over 30,000 miles of fiber across some of the most remote rural areas in Kentucky. Approximately 217,000 rural homes are served by our association members, and that includes nearly 150,000 homes and businesses that have fiber to the premises available with gigabit access. So again, that's gigabit symmetrical service. And again, we talk about being community-based providers. We're in your backyards. We sponsor Little League teams. We do all these things. And so we're very invested in our local communities over the course of our operations here in the Commonwealth. And again, some of our companies have been in existence for 70 or 80 years in the telephony business before we even got into broadband. But we've invested over $1.7 billion in property, plant, and equipment throughout our operations in the Commonwealth. Just over the past year, we've invested more than $111 million in our fiber networks across the Commonwealth. We plan to invest $291 million additional dollars over the next couple of years. And again, we serve small businesses in our communities and our schools, and so we're very proud of the fact that we serve a number of small businesses, over 12,000 small businesses, 217 schools are served in our service territories. And again, we're responsible for 1,100 direct jobs in the Commonwealth. One thing that I did want to touch on, and I think the pandemic brought to light more than anything, was the ability for remote work. Metropolitan and micropolitan areas, obviously talk about being gigabit capable in gig cities. You've probably heard that phrase a lot. Well, our smart rural broadband providers are looking to do something similar in our marketing efforts because, like everyone else, we want to be attractive to site selectors, to employers, to those remote workers that we're trying to get to move to the Commonwealth. Because, again, rural communities are some of the best places to live, work, and raise a family. And so So our national association has developed a program, and many of our members are partners with that in what's called smart rural communities. And so some of these members right here are listed. We have others that are going through the program right now, but some of these telephone cooperatives, small commercial companies may be in your service territories, in your backyard. But the NTCA Smart Rural Communities, in order to qualify for this program, you must be an NTCA ILEC member in good standing with the association, but you must offer 100 meg broadband to 50% or more of your residents within your service area, have broadband subscription rates of at least 50%, and affirm your commitment to the Smart Rural Community principles and collaboration. Again, this is just another great marketing tool that our Smart Rural Communities are working with their industrial authorities, their economic development folks in their communities in order to advertise these rural communities. It's saying, again, we have fiber broadband service in our communities. If you're a remote worker, we want you here. This is a great place to live, a great place to work, and a great place to raise a family. And we have the broadband connections that you need in order to do what you need to do. And again, I think more than anything, the pandemic created a spotlight on the need to invest in our rural broadband infrastructure. When everybody was suddenly at home, and I live in central Kentucky, I represent members throughout rural areas of the state in western, southern, and eastern Kentucky. But I mean, just like everybody else, we were conducting multiple Zoom meetings at one time. My children were at our desk while my wife was on a Zoom call in one room. I may have been with the kids in another. So you could see the demands and the stress for video services and broadband were never more apparent than during the pandemic. But I would like to take this opportunity, and Secretary Hicks had mentioned it earlier, but I do want to thank the General Assembly for allocating the $300 million of ARPA funds into the State Broadband Deployment Fund. I really do want to thank Chairman Petrie, Vice Chair Reed was in here earlier. I know Chairman Pratt. We had worked on establishing the Broadband Deployment Fund as a group of stakeholders back in 2020. This was before we even saw, again, what was coming with the pandemic. So that fund was established. We were able to actually fund it a couple of years later with the ARPA funds as folks realized that broadband funds were necessary. So as you were talking about earlier, Representative Kulkarni, you can see these different pots of money. And states, these trends that you're seeing for funds, other states are doing similar things to what Kentucky's doing in terms of using those ARPA dollars. Some use CARES Act dollars, some used ARPA dollars in order to expand their broadband infrastructure. Another program that was mentioned that is a federal program is the USDA Reconnect Fund. That's actually through the USDA, the Department of Agriculture's Office of Rural Development. And these Reconnect funds, they actually are very similar in nature. They go to areas, the first two iterations of the USDA Reconnect Fund were areas that lacked 10-1 the first two rounds. 90% of those homes that to be served, if you were applying for a 100% grant, had to lack 10-1 access in the first two rounds. Subsequent rounds, that threshold changed. It was areas that lacked 100/20 access in the last two rounds. But that's through USDA Reconnect funds. And so our members, again, represent very rural areas in our service territories, but we have been very successful in going after some of these federal dollars. And just to mention briefly, our members have secured since the inception of the program in 2018, and it was funded in 2019. Over $117 million in grant and loans have been allocated to our members in Kentucky. And there may have been more money specifically for Reconnect because there's other rural electric cooperatives have participated in this program, and I can actually get that information to the committee on each one of the announcements. But just speaking on behalf of our members, over the four rounds, the four iterations that have taken place, our members have secured about $117 million of that, which for grants and loans, which will bring fiber to the premises, again, gigabit symmetrical speeds available to locations that include residences, farms, businesses, education, and healthcare facilities in numerous rural counties. Over 12,000 locations in the state will receive that because of the Reconnect funds. And briefly, I won't go through each of the awards, but just some of the counties that were touched by these Reconnect grants. Adair, multiple awards rounds for Cumberland County, Russell, Breathitt County we've had providers receive multiple awards for Breathitt, Powell, Leslie, Lee, McCracken, and Grave counties, just to name a few. So those will all be counties that will be impacted and have fiber broadband built out to some residences in those areas. And again, I will get you the specific information on the breakdown of those reconnect build outs. And then I do want to touch on, our members did participate in the Better Internet program here at the state level. Of that $90 million that was let out, our members, we had members that received, I think, 5 grant awards to the tune of about building out to 1,900 locations, about $16 million, both in grant and matching funds for our members. So we're very excited about that. Again, we've had even more of our members have applied for this second round of grant funding, and look forward to hearing about those announcements for that available $206 million of funding next month. And then one other federal program that I would like to touch on, and I think it was mentioned here earlier, and this is another one of those pots of money, is the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. This program was administered and overseen by the Federal Communications Commission in a phase one. It was in a reverse auction. This resulted in $148.9 million that will go out to 11 providers in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And again, this is not CapEx support, and that's a very big distinction. A lot of this money that's being put out there right now will subsidize construction. The RDOF, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, is basically for operational expenses over a 10-year period. So you basically commit to serve a certain number of locations in these areas, and you will get back a certain level of support over a 10-year period. That's how the reverse auction worked. And so in Kentucky, over this 10-year period, 11 providers have committed to serve almost 99,000 unserved locations. And unserved, by this definition, is areas that lack 25.3. And so you're going to get about another $149 million flowing in to the Commonwealth for broadband deployment, in addition to what we've talked about with the ARPA funds and in addition to the Reconnect funds that have already come into Kentucky. So I did want to say that there's about another $149 million over a 10-year period that will come in to the Commonwealth for those companies that secured RDOF funding. We did have a couple of companies, these reverse auctions, you bid down, so there were some areas there. We did have a couple of members. Representative Truitt, you're very familiar, obviously. PRTC does a great job in your district. They've been very competitive in the Reconnect program, very similar to RDOF. They secured support for over 2,400 locations in Lee, Rock Castle, and portions of Clay and Laurel counties through RDOF. So they'll build this out over the course of 10 years. And to the point earlier about the obligations that you have, there are, even with the RDOF program, there are certain metrics that are put in place. You have to build out to a certain percent of locations in order to receive this operational support. So you have to, within so many years, you have to build out to 40%, 60%, and then 100% by the end of the operational support for the 10 years. So there are metrics put in place in terms of being able to draw down these funds. And I wanted to mention Foothills Communication. They actually secured operational support over $3 million for over 2,100 locations in Carter, Boyd, and Floyd County through the RDOF funding. So I know that was a lot of alphabet soup, and there's a lot going on there. But, again, it just goes to show whether you're a large carrier or small carriers that serve in these rural areas, we are looking for ways to close the digital divide. We're being very aggressive in how we're pursuing some of these federal funds. This is a picture right here of North Central Telecom Cooperative. This was actually at their celebration for their 100% fiber cutover. So all of the customers in NCTC's territory now have fiber broadband available to them. And so they are working in partnership, and again, talking about ways of securing maybe non-traditional avenues. They are in partnership with Warren Rural Electric, a TVA rural electric cooperative, and they have brought broadband to 6,000 additional customers within Warren Rural Electric service territory. And they're continuing to expand on this program each and every day. So I just want to say there are other ways that we are looking in terms of partnerships. This, again, we're working with local governments, whether it's fiscal courts, even some municipalities. We're working to try to see what we can do in order to meet the needs of those constituents. And I'll go through this. Megan and them touched on this a lot, but the next big thing is BEAD. Obviously, you got $42.5 billion coming to the states. and I know John will probably touch on this with his study, but the latest numbers that we've received, and I was in Washington, D.C. talking with folks just a week ago, around $1.1 billion is the estimates that we've heard. And John, they've done a study that can dig down into that more than I can. But there's going to be challenges and opportunities with this. Obviously, we've talked about the challenge process that we have here in the state. We have to submit that as part of our federal program. Megan mentioned the maps. We're going to have a state broadband map, that action plan. And there are a lot of requirements. And I know that was mentioned earlier, like what do we have to do? There are going to be requirements. There's, I think, 15 mandates within the BEAD program for ISPs to basically follow. And that's going to include, things like Buy American provisions, labor guidelines, cybersecurity guidelines, how we have to interact with our suppliers, things that maybe some groups may not have had to deal with before. So if you're an ISP, you're going to have to really watch and engage on this program if you want to be a part of this. You have to. We were talking about affordability earlier. If you want to engage in the BEAD program, you have to participate in the Affordable Connectivity Plan or program with the FCC, which provides a subsidy for low-income families. All of our providers in Kentucky, or my members, are doing that, or most are doing that anyway. But the affordability options are a part of this conversation too. So there are just a lot of requirements if you're going to be eligible to even bid as a subrecipient to the state that you're going to have to engage with in order to follow through on the program. And then finally, there's just a few other things I want to touch on. We're not immune to any of this like any other industry. Workforce development. How are we going to find enough contractors to perform this work? How are we going to be able to do this when we know we have these timelines that are available? Megan talked about the timelines. So there are project guidelines and timelines associated with this. So we're not immune to this like any other group. Supply chain issues. I will say COVID exacerbated the supply chain for us. We've taken measures as a national association, NTCA, which is our national association partner. They've helped us secure, through a national partnership with Corning, which is a fiber manufacturer here, the ability to do bulk purchase and collaborate with other groups in our industry to do bulk purchasing for fiber. So that may move us up on the list for an order. So we are trying to be creative nationally and at the state level, even as small providers, in ways to meet these issues. But, electronics, certain equipment, if you inject $42 billion suddenly into the system, does that supply chain tighten up again? So these are all questions that could impact future broadband deployment. And then I know this is probably, you hear this ad nauseum from businesses in general, but environmental permitting review process, it is a very real deal. I can give you examples of those reconnect projects that I mentioned earlier, just a couple of them that were slowed down 18 to 24 months in construction just for environmental review processes. And I'm not saying that those aren't important, but there should be ways that we can streamline some of those processes at the federal level. And then finally, I'm just going to touch on these are very high broad issues that we're talking about at the state level, or I'm sorry, at the federal level, that could impact even beyond what we're talking about with BEAD, but the future of broadband service. Once this money's out there and once we build out, how do we sustain these networks? What do we do? That's the future of universal service. Right now, each and every one of you, if you have a landline or a cell phone, you'll see a note on your bill. I don't even know how many people look at their bills anymore, but you'll see one that says Universal Service Fund. And that actually goes, there are 4 programs that Universal Service actually funds. But one of those is the highest cost program that helps deploy at reasonable rates. And so your constituents in these rural areas can expect telephony service and broadband service at a reasonable rate compared to their urban counterparts. That's funded through the Universal Service Program. And so as more people have, and that's paid for by a fee that's assessed on bills from telecommunication providers, from their customers, and so for internet, interstate and international end user revenues. But as you know, landlines are going away. As more and more people drop their access lines, that contribution factor, the stress on the budget of the Universal Service Fund keeps going up. And so what can we do at the federal level to bring in more people that may not be contributing to the Universal Service Fund? That there's a whole debate being had in Congress right now about that very issue, because there are people who lay their platforms on top of our networks that remit absolutely nothing to the Universal Service Fund. So those questions are taking place right now. Taxation of broadband grants, all this grant money that's out there right now. There's policy discussions being had right now. Right now, as of 2017, as an offset to the Tax Cut and Jobs Acts, these broadband grants are actually being taxed. And so you're getting these broadband grants, and then you're turning around and paying, I think, a 21% rate back to the Treasury. So we're supporting efforts at the federal level, again, to pull this back. It doesn't make a lot of sense when we're trying to deploy and get to that last mile in some of these very rural areas that we award somebody to do this, and then we're turning around and taking 21% of that back. So we're supporting efforts at that level. And then, as we've just stated, there's a lot of priorities that will be debated in the Farm Bill. A lot of broadband language goes through the USDA and the Farm Bill. So things that we've talked about, like interagency cooperation so that we can prevent overbuilding in these areas, streamlining these regulatory programs, streamlining these programs, whether they're speed thresholds that, as Secretary Hicks were alluding to, that have already been enacted by Congress that, basically make mirroring them across the spectrum. All of that can be contained in the Farm Bill. And so we're addressing that with our congressional delegation right now and supporting our priorities there. I know I spit a lot out at you, and I can turn it over to John now, and happy to answer any questions at the end.
Real quick before we go to Mr. Higginbotham, Representative McPherson, I think had a question specifically with your presentation, Tyler.
Okay.
So I represent the 22nd District, which is Allen, Simpson, and a portion of Warren County.
Yes.
And I do have North Central there that have done a wonderful job and went over into Warren County and helped them. And then we had RDOF in Simpson County that was rewarded a portion of that area. It was my understanding that contract prohibited any other state funding from being awarded in those areas, that other providers could go in there, but they couldn't ask for any other state funding. They were kind of blocked out from those areas. Is this BEAD program going to be relative the same way?
I may have to revert to Megan on the actual guidelines for that. I know that they are. I was going to say.
Meg, if you can make your way, if you don't care, just so we can have you on record. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, during the initial proposal, we have to do our state challenge process, and that includes what the NTIA is calling the deduplication of previously funded areas. So any place that has an RDOF commitment or a Reconnect loan or grant or any other federal funding, we have to remove from consideration and eligibility.
And so just to follow up with that just a second was, that 10-year build-out period just really gives a lot of residents some heartburn, I guess, saying now we're blocked out from any other grant. And I understand that once you have an area that has grant money, that you don't want to really keep duplicating that, but we necessarily want to go back and make sure if you've got a child that's in first or second grade and you're 10 years getting this, and I know there's percentages that they have to build out to pretty quick, and in Simpson County, luckily, they took this on real early, and I think they're going to be fully built out probably within the next year or so. So once they get in an area, they're probably going to stay there until they finish. But it was just a little bit concerning about once you get there, you've blocked any other monies from coming in out of that.
But I will say, Representative McPherson, and I didn't want to speak because I know they are issuing continual NTIA guidelines on this. But I will say that is pretty consistent with other programs. They are trying to stop. Again, they're wanting to maximize dollars into to new areas as much as possible and extend broadband deployment as much. That is pretty consistent though with other federal programs. So.
And I applaud the fact that once you're doing that, you have but we just want to make sure it gets done. Appreciate it.
I'm going to go real quick to also Representative Kilcarney, I think, on the same maybe topic here.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your thorough explanation. I wanted to refer back to something you mentioned when you were talking about the smart rural communities, about 50% subscription rate. What happens if that isn't met in a particular area, and are you concerned about any specific areas, or does that not matter?
No, I mean, I will say this is something that our members are doing within our national association, so it's a specific marketing program. Most of the folks that are either looking at this or examining, what those take rates are, most of the people that are in our areas, they're pretty confident if they're going through the process of that program that they're going to be able to meet that threshold. So, it's like everything else. We aggressively market, and I will say, and I'm proud to do this, we have some of the fastest speeds in the throughout any community in some of these very rural communities that our members represent. So, I mean, when I say we have gigabit symmetrical speeds, we really do. So, a lot of people want to be able to take advantage of that, and so that's one of the reasons why these programs have been successful. We're trying to recruit those remote workers and new employers to areas because they're fascinated that they can go down to Jackson County and get gigabit symmetrical speeds and live in an area where the cost of living is relatively inexpensive compared to other parts of the country. And we're anecdotally, I'm hearing that from my general managers and CEOs all the time. Like, we're getting contacted by folks. I had a member tell me they got contacted by somebody out of New Jersey and just said, I really like Kentucky. I went down there. They visited Keeneland and Horses and loved the area, but they wanted to live in eastern Kentucky County, just, again, cost of living. And they found out they had broadband access in these rural areas from one of our members, and they're looking to locate here from New Jersey. So I hear anecdotal stories like that all the time.
Okay, so not a concern where it's if it doesn't meet a financial model of 50%, you're not going to provide service. Or
No. Our members, if they're, again, and these are a lot of our folks that take advantage of this. Some are small commercial companies that are members of the National Association, but again, for our member co-ops, if they're a member there and they want the service, they're going to find a way to build out to them most of the time. Now, I will say it's like everything else. If they haven't had fiber service there, it takes time to cut over into a fiber network. Maybe they had VDSL or DSL service previously, but within our ILEC area, these members, we're trying to get to them like anything else. They're on a construction schedule to get cut over to fiber.
And then your workforce, I want to understand specifically what the positions are. So GIS, software.
It could be. I'll honestly say right now, the one of the biggest issues that we have is just getting the experience and number of contractors for construction type services. Again, these build outs, because again, we're building out in these areas, and we're trying to be an aggressive timeline. Like, we want to meet the timelines to get this service out there as quickly as we can to our members. In order to do that, I'd say pre-pandemic, you would have multiple contractors bid on a job, even a $3-4 million job in one of our areas. That may be peanuts to some, but it's it could be a big deal for a rural broadband provider to build out. You're building out to 1,500 locations for a $4 million build. But now we may only get one contractor, and then that bids on that job. And then it's not only that, but if there's subsequent phases of that same project, keeping the contractor there when you have them, because they're being stretched out and being stretched thin as well, because again, so much of this money is being injected into the system, and this is before BEAD even takes place.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Representative Stalker.
Thank you. My question, I'm looking kind of further down the road in this project, and what I'm curious about is a couple of things. What does the communication process look like to residents? So all of a sudden this becomes available in these communities that have had nothing. A lot of these communities potentially are rural, they're lower income. I'm curious about what that looks like as far as making sure that people know once it is available, what steps in order to apply to become eligible to get that discounted credit. So a two-part question, I guess, and that's if you have the ability to speak on this, because I understand this is a little bit further down the road, but I worry about for folks who are in low-income areas, you're also typically dealing with individuals who are unbanked. They might not have credit card access, things of that nature. So I think about, I've got a credit card connected to my internet and it just gets billed every, does that make sense what I'm asking as far as what that communication process looks like to folks, and to make sure that they can actually take advantage of this even if they may not have the traditional means of being able to connect a credit card because they're unbanked? Have you all thought about that in your process for these communities and how people can actually pay for whatever their portion might be monthly?
Okay. So for the Affordable Connectivity Program, that's the subsidy program. That is something that the internet providers can help them apply for to show up as a credit on their bill. There's also a lot of the providers offer their own affordability program, a discount program in order to address some of those. But as far as the billing, I mean, I think that works like the same as any other utility billing, whether it's, they pay with check or drop off cash or whatever in the office.
And I will say that, for the Affordable Connectivity program, our marketing departments for most of our members are, they're doing bill inserts, they're doing advertisements. I was speaking to a group, the SOAR, Shaping Our Appalachian Region board meeting, executive committee meeting just a week ago. They were down there talking amongst the judge executives that are a part of that group and those individuals in Eastern Kentucky about their ability to advertise to their constituents in their areas. So they're making that a part of a plan that they have. I think they are actually were pursuing an FCC outreach grant. So there are things that communities are doing to stay engaged. I mean, obviously, SOAR, for an example, that's a 54 county region. So they're going to be trying to secure an outreach grant in order to help them advertise for ACP, which would help provide this subsidy for those and make people aware of that. So it's probably a two-part answer. One, we're doing this internally. Also, as part of the state's digital equity plan, I think there's going to be conversations about how to advertise and make sure people know that these services are available.
Tyler, I'm going to give you a break. John, I'm going to let you proceed. I know we're losing a few members of other commitments, so at your discretion, please proceed.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is John Higginbotham, Executive Vice President, Chief Operating Officer with ACA Connects. Thanks again for the opportunity to meet with you all today to talk about trends in broadband development. More on the national scale is what I'm here to talk about. Previous to my tenure at ACA Connects, I worked right here in Frankfort for the Frankfort Plant Board for 25 long years and retired in 2017, and my wife and I reside in Mount Sterling. ACA Connects members provide affordable basic and advanced services to more than 23 million households in the United States. ACA Connects members operate in every state, offering next-generation internet access, video, and digital phone service. ACA Connects asks lawmakers and regulators to ensure fair treatment to the small and medium-sized independent operators that we represent that supply these services in Main Street America. And through active participation in the policymaking process, ACA Connects members and leaders advocate for the interest of their customers, their companies, and their communities to ensure that continued viability of their way of life in hometown America. In Kentucky, there are 38 ACA Connects members, and many that we share with Tyler and his state organization, serving 714,000 households and providing service to parts of 103 counties. These members include telephone companies that are with Tyler, family-owned companies, electric cooperative municipalities, and private equity members. I want to touch on some national trends in broadband developed over the next couple of minutes. The first is competition. Last year, ACA Connects released a study analyzing the state of competition in the fixed broadband marketplace. We found that competition is thriving and will become only more intense in the near future. Specifically, the vast majority of U.S. households either already have or will soon have access to at least two providers of fast and reliable fixed broadband service. 5G fixed wireless and other technologies are providing additional competitive options. In any consideration of whether additional or more intrusive broadband regulation is necessary to protect consumers, it's critical that federal policymakers take into account the fact that competition exists in most markets and is continuing to spread rapidly. The next thing I'd like to talk about is a study we just put out yesterday. It's the third version of this study, hot off the press about lunchtime. I sent it to Megan as soon as I got it from our research partners. And let me back up a little bit to tell you about the study a little bit. In September of last year, ACA Connects and its research partner Cartesian published the first version of our BEAD program framework. Lawyers must have wrote that title. Our aim was to give states a jump start on preparing their initial proposals and 5-year action plans by providing the states with estimates about the funding that we thought that the states would receive and the potential ways that it could spend the money on broadband deployment using fiber first, as the notice of funding opportunity requires, and then with other broadband network technologies. In December, we released an update of our analysis based on the first release of those national broadband maps that the FCC put out there, which greatly increased the accuracy of our estimates and analysis, even though the maps are still a work in progress. So far, we've been gratified by the reception of our work, and we have enjoyed the many follow-up discussions with state broadband offices across the United States. Yesterday, we released version 3 of the BEAD program framework. It relies on the much more accurate national broadband map released just last month. It also incorporates additional locations where government agencies have committed funds for broadband deployments, as reflected in the FCC's funding map released earlier in May. And Megan touched on it a little while ago about, would you say, 15,000 different objections that you guys raised that have gone into this this second version of this map that was just released about a month ago. Finally, it recognizes that as states award funds for broadband deployment projects during 2024 and in later years, the states will need to account for ongoing deployments funded through other programs, as Megan and Tyler have both discussed, or relying solely on private capital that bring service to locations previously classified as unserved or underserved. Our analysis from this study that we put out yesterday, we estimate that Kentucky will receive $1.1 billion from NTIA, and with a $600 million match from the service providers, the Commonwealth may have as much as $1.7 billion to close this digital divide. Our estimates provide for servicing more than 157,000 unserved and more than 46,000 underserved locations. ACA Connects estimates that there is funding to reach all of Kentucky's 203,000 eligible locations with high-speed broadband, and it leaves significant leftover funds for the affordability programs that Megan talked about earlier. We've included a sensitivity analysis in our new version 3 study from yesterday, and I want to touch on that for just a second. We have modeled 2 sensitivity adjusted cases to explore the impact of states awarding subgrants like ARPA, like RDOF, and some others grants that Kentucky is doing, and other states are across the United States, and the impact beyond January of 2024. This analysis assumes that there's an incremental build in the period between the allocation of BEAD funds, which we're not exactly sure when that's going to be, but sometime after the first of 2024, and it might be spread out into 25 and possibly even 2026. And so we want to understand what that incremental build that's happening at the same time at the ground level as this money is flowing out. And so we want to understand what the subgrants awards for deployment projects are made, and that will reduce the number of BEAD eligible locations. BEAD program subgrant awards are likely to start, like I said, later in 24 or early 24, and maybe staged out over several years. With a later start, ongoing builds by our members will further reduce the number of eligible locations, which is an absolutely great thing, because that's our ultimate goal, is to serve everybody. Now, as I move on from that, as it relates to BEAD funding, here are some thoughts that ACA Connects has been communicating at the federal Capitol and at NTIA. As we explained in comments filed at the NTIA, ACA urges all states, Kentucky included, to use the FCC broadband maps as the authoritative source for identifying locations that are unserved or underserved. The FCC's maps are the sole mechanism for collecting data nationally based on well-vetted rules and verification process. In establishing the BEAD program, Congress reinforced the primacy of the FCC maps by defining eligible projects relative to whether the unserved and or underserved locations largely comprising eligible projects are determined to be unserved or underserved in a map. We recognize the FCC maps have flaws, but they are diminishing. And we agree that with NTIA that the FCC maps are becoming more accurate and continue to get better. And based on our service availability challenges received so far, our members' submissions have proven largely accurate, and in limited instances where there were shortcomings, they're being addressed through the FCC challenge process, much like Megan talked about earlier. Thus, the FCC maps, provide the solid information on which the state challenge process should be built, and which every location identified as unserved or underserved in the initial proposal and subgrant application should be based. I want to touch on one. We've touched on it a couple of times, and I kind of want to close with it. And this is the great uncertainty around the future of the Affordable Connectivity Program. That's the voucher program for lower income. We're proud that more than 300 ACA Connects members are participating in this program. They have found it to be a great way of connecting with low-income households in their communities that serve and otherwise maybe wouldn't have broadband. But ACP is expected to run out of money sometime in early 2024, and as of yet, there is no plan to replenish these funds on the federal level. Our members have found success with the program and would welcome the program being extended. but they, our members, may not be the strongest advocates. State governments can be a powerful voice here, especially given the importance of ACP within the BEAD program. If you accept BEAD funds as this program is laid out today, you have to offer ACP, a low-income voucher system. The funds are going to deplete here in the next probably 8 to 9 months. And so there's quite a lot of uncertainty of what's going to happen with that. If ACP goes away, BEAD funds are unlikely to go as far as they should in connecting households that really need internet access. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I will ensure that members have access to our study. It was so hot off the press, I just couldn't bring it with me today, but I guarantee I will get it to you by first thing in the morning. I am happy to answer your questions and appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the information presentation. A couple questions. Co-Chair King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hickenbotham, you must have read my mind. Your last comment was exactly about my question. I was going to ask, a lot of times, regardless of what type of programming it is, if we bring down federal dollars, they come with extra protocols and standards and hoops we have to jump through. So I think you've touched on one right there. I know we desperately need these funds, but are we setting ourselves up for federal requirements that are going to be difficult to meet in the future?
Yes, and Megan's going to have the worst part of that job, running the state office here. It's a real problem. We've been talking about it. I know that the NTCA, the group that Tyler works with, they're friends of ours. We have similar membership. We've been in D.C. for the last 9 months saying, hey, more folks are eligible and are taking advantage of ACP than was originally anticipated when the dollars were put out during the middle of the pandemic. And gosh, we need to figure out how the heck we're going to put more money into that. And the federal government needs to do that because the states, quite frankly, you don't have the money to do it. I wanted to touch on something else too. The lady asked earlier, in talking with our members across the country, and I'm sure it's happening here in Kentucky as well, how do you get the word out on ACP? How do you inform folks? We've found in listening to our members that going to the schools, going to the library, health departments, heck, just getting on the local radio, any way that you can reach your members with the, in addition to, a bill stuffer or any kind of communication that you have within your billing that goes to those customers or ways that you can do that. We have a lot of members, have one member in Louisiana that went door to door. And they just decided to do it that way because they had kids in the summertime that were looking for part-time jobs, and they could help these folks fill out the forms and gain access to this $30 voucher each month. Everybody does a little different. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Some of our members are really enthused about the program. Others want to participate, but they lay a lot of that on the actual subscriber to kind of do all the work. And so it just depends on who you are and what are the outcomes that you want to try and achieve.
Good. Thank you. Senator Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, I think everybody shares the goal of having more access to high-speed internet and broadband and on the committee. One question I had, and I know this may not be the right solution for every area, but some of the I know a few people that use satellite internet providers like Skylink that are very satisfied with their connection and it provides an adequate speed. And clearly, with constantly evolving technology, we may lay some fiber and in 5 years it's obsolete and it has to go out and we have to rewire it again, which is a constant, cost to the taxpayers who are subsidizing a lot of these projects. And I'm for that, but sometimes it's easier just to swap out a dish or something than it is to replace 100 miles of cable. Is that something that we're looking at as well for areas where it's appropriate?
From a technology standpoint, I'm going to kind of revert to as an operator, as I was here in Frankfurt for a long time. The fiber that we took to Peaks Mill and Bald Knob is 31 years old this year, still working great. And so the longevity of the fiber that's being put in there today is going to have a 35 to 50 year lifespan. Now, the money you have to spend is on the ends of that. The technology does change on pushing and pulling the information over that fiber. And those are typically 7 to 10 year life cycles to switch out the gear that you have in your home or that's back at the central office where the internet originates as it comes into a community. Those are things that have to be built into the rates that our operators provide as a kind of a management tool to a continuous upgrade and challenge as technology changes. And that truly is built into the rate that the subscriber pays for each month, how to pay for these upgrades 6 years, 8 years, 10 years from now.
Senator Wheeler, I'll just add really quick. We refer to fiber as future-proof networks just because, again, if you switch out the electronics on the end of that at the end of that life cycle, generally you can switch the circuits out, and those circuits will have, you could go from a 5 gig to a 10 gig circuit, so you can keep up with demand for end to end on that fiber easier than you can most other technologies. So I would wager that in terms of fiber, just in terms of the switching out the electronics, the life cycle of the fiber itself will outlast a dish that'll be put on a home.
Okay. Brief follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Please proceed.
I mean, but maybe in certain areas, say if we only had to reach 2 homes that may be out there that might cost, say, tens of thousands of dollars to get out there, would it might not be maybe a more economical thing if we provided a similar subsidy to get something like an individual link up for these houses rather than spending all that money to get out there?
I mean, that's built into BEAD. It's fiber first. But in those instances where it's 7 more miles down that road to that next home, there are alternative technologies that can be deployed. But as we understand the study, as we've studied it over the course of the last year, specific to Kentucky, we think there's going to be enough money that's going to flow to this state. You're going to be able to touch fiber optics to every household that is unserved and underserved. That 203,000 today.
Well, there may be enough money coming, but that might not be the most efficient allocation of that money. I mean, clearly, I think that Representative McPherson talked about other areas that perhaps need an upgrade to get their maximum potential that might serve more customers. Will be better off repurposing that money to get the maximum impact over all areas of the state using a variety of technologies rather than spending all that extra money to put fiber out to the last house on the holler, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are going to be individual decisions. I honestly, I don't know the BEAD program as well as Megan does, to be quite honest with you. Are there limitations within BEAD, what you can do with the money once it's awarded? I don't know the answer to the question, sir.
So one of the requirements in the initial proposal, we have to set what's called the high cost location threshold, and that is a dollar figure where we are able to consider proposals that are not fiber proposals. And so there's a little push and pull on that because we want to set it high enough that we are not overcommitting to fiber, but low enough so that we don't undercommit to fiber. So like somewhere in the middle, and we have some ways to measure that. We have some past experience on what the average cost per location is on our grants we've issued, and then some cost modeling data that's forthcoming from the cost quest that has produced the FCC maps. So those are things we're evaluating.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you all. Seeing no further questions, approaching the 90-minute portion, I was going to see what was going to finish first. Representative McPherson, your granddaughter's lollipop she had back there, or the committee meeting today, and I think she's going to win out on this one. Thank you all so much. Thanks for the information. Thanks, everybody, for your attendance and your indulgence of the questions. And I ask for a motion for adjournment. So moved. See you all next month.